Humans of the cardboard, welcome back to Just Nuts, guys. Today, we are talking about building rogue decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Particularly for this upcoming format. This is post-Darkwing Blast. I know we're going to get Magnificent Mavens, which will change some things. I'm not debating that at all. But it's definitely we definitely have a lot to keep in mind here overall. So, without further ado, we're going to get into this thing and kind of just talk about some of the factors that I think if you are looking to build specifically a rogue deck because you're like me, you don't want to play the deck where you have to play multiple mirror matches, everyone's on it, everyone's built to beat it. It comes with its own downsides of playing the best decks in the game. And I like playing something interesting, something more fun, something that people aren't going to be ready for, because I think it has its own benefits as well. So, first and foremost, you got to obviously look at this, and your deck has to be competent, right? You can't just take Ice Barriers and say, "Whoa, by Ice Barriers doesn't lose to Bystial. We're cooking." Even if it has a technically good matchup, if your deck's engine and the way it works is just downright not strong enough, it's not going to matter anyway. So you have to have a deck that already has a competent enough win condition. So that's the first place to start. So obviously now from there we move to a bunch of the specific metagame things. So first and foremost, we have Tearlaments. You got to keep an eye on this deck. This is one of the scariest decks in the game. One of the things that I would really highlight as far as this matchup in particular was I would like to see, if I'm trying to pick a rogue deck, I would want to build a deck that has access to removal that is not sending to the graveyard in any way. Destruction, send, whatever. Even if it's the Rika rank 8 that tributes as effect, not as cost, it still triggers the Tearlaments. So they put up these monsters. You can go over them by battle. You can shuffle them, bounce them, banish them, whatever. As long as you're not giving them their triggers, you're going to be able to counterbalance a lot of the resources they're going to try and float into, which should be your goal. Because on a lot of board states, once you've played through a lot of their interruption, they're just stuck with what's on field. And a lot of times they say, "Hey, out me without sending me to grave. I dare you." And if you can't, they're going to have more resources going into their next turn and could potentially take the duel back over in a grind. So I would look for that. A deck that has access to that type of removal that does give Tearlament more problems. For sure. 100%. Next up, we have Sprites. Sprites are a weird one. They can be built a ton of different ways. We're seeing more pure builds come back around because Sprint is out now, and he helps them so much. We're seeing the Nimble package played a lot. Triple Beaver, double Angler, I think is the common package. It's kind of tough. This deck has lots of ways to play through the mediocre hand traps. It does play a little bit more into Nib now than it did before because a lot of times they're going Sprint first, then into Gigantic, and a lot of times Gigantic has to be their 5th summon, so you could hit them before they're able to resolve Gigantic, which is kind of funny, but I don't know, they're not always going to play into it if they don't have to. But yeah, they're tough. I would say maybe a deck that can put big bodies on the field easily. Maybe that's just, maybe not necessarily when you're picking the deck, but maybe some tech cards. You're looking at Tearlaments of Fenrir, the Bystial cards, all really good in Sprite because the boards they set up are quite weak stat-wise. So if you can just put beaters on the field, you can threaten multiple interruptions from them before you actually have to start committing your actual engine to the field. That could definitely be something to keep in mind, but you obviously have to keep Sprites in mind. Runics as well. We know this engine's crazy and in multiple different ways. We've seen it played with Sprite as one of the most common ways. I still think it's going to be one of the top builds with the Nimble variant. We've also see some play with Tear as of late. That's a really interesting development. And obviously we've seen pure Mystic Mind Runic, weird stuff like that. That's also getting the job done at times. So I wouldn't play a deck that has no way to play into these cards. Maybe there are certain rogue decks out there that only really set up monster negation but not spell and trap negation, or only monster removal but not spell and trap removal. That becomes very difficult if you play a deck like this because you just have nothing to mess with this engine. You just have to deal with it. They're drawing a ton of cards. They're hitting you with a bunch of interactive quick plays, and if you have no way to deal with it, you're going to be in a world of hurt. So you have to look out for Runics. Runics are huge here. Fourth factor, it's Bystial. These cards are going to be everywhere. One thing that is worth noting, though, is if you are a deck that loses to DD Crow but not necessarily Bystial, I think you're in a decent position for this specific format. We could see times where DD Crow maybe comes back into formats because it's more flexible, hits spell traps, hits non-light dark monsters. That could actually come up over the, higher ceiling cards that the Bystials are, but you have to be wary of them if you're a deck similar to Sprite, where you do have trouble with big monsters. Even if the interruption isn't that good, you're still going to be in trouble just by getting run over when your opponent's going second. And then, of course, if you want to play a really good rogue deck, but it's Orchist, and you just lose to one Bystial most of the time, you really just can't afford to play it. It's just way too fragile to a package like this that's going to be played by so many players. This package is going to be played by almost everybody right now. So I would definitely avoid this one at all costs. You can definitely play it, but I just wouldn't play a deck that loses to it too hard. And the last card here is Fenrir. This one's a weird one because Fenrir's just so generically good. I don't know if I can think of anything in particular that's so obviously oh, that's an insane Fenrir matchup. This deck destroys Fenrir. There are going to be decks that play into it way easier, where you can use spell effects, use monster effects in hand and grave before actually having to use them on the field, because this guy only targets a face-up card your opponent controls to banish it. So if you can threaten him before you actually have a face-up monster, or threaten him just without activating a monster effect, in that bad situation, then obviously you have a better matchup. It's just something kind of like the Bystials. You're going to see this card a lot. You have to be able to handle it. You just cannot afford to play a deck that's going to crumble to this card, because you just should expect to see it in any given match in a competitive scene. So those are the 5 factors that I think are the biggest things to keep an eye out for. There are obviously other things you need to keep in mind, but a lot of that stuff can be smoothed out in the side deck with tech options in the main deck. These are the 5 biggest factors to me that if you're going to pick a rogue deck for this current format, you need to be ready for. One other thing to keep in mind with Magnificent Mavens being 2 weeks away, it's right around the corner, even though, actually it's a little more than 2 weeks away, I think. Maybe it's more 3 weeks away, but it's still close enough where I'm this video is only going to be fully relevant for a couple weeks. But if I add this in here, it's something to note. The new Ishizu cards are crazy. Nothing else from that set is really that concerning to me. There's reprints of nice cards, but it's really just the Ishizu cards as far as warping the format. It's just going into tier. This is all going back to tier pretty much, because the Ishizu cards make this deck even better, getting you crazy access to insane amounts of mills. And you have to be ready for it. And the difference also is, even though you could maybe play a deck that does use the graveyard quite a bit, let's say, for example, the new Naturia deck when it comes out, you're Earth, so you don't really care. Your whole deck is Earth, so you don't really care about the Bystial cards that much. But what you do care about is the Ishizu cards. If you play against them, Mudora and I believe Keldor are the 2 biggest ones as far as those matchups go, where they have the ability to shuffle up to 3 cards in your graveyard back into your deck. Which is a huge problem. I can't remember if they shuffle or banish, but either way, it removes them from grave. It's still annoying because the whole idea of the Naturia deck is get Mole Cricket started, and then Mole Cricket is going to run away with advantage for you. But if they get to those cards, they're just going to handle the Mole Cricket from there, and kind of cut you off from that. So there you go. You start having trouble there. So honestly, I hate to say it because I know so many decks need the graveyard. I would definitely look at a deck that doesn't lose. You can still play a deck that goes in the graveyard. We're not saying play Floowandereeze because they don't touch the graveyard at all. I would say more so just a deck that doesn't outright lose to one or 2 graveyard removals at quick speed, because that's where you're just going to get blown out by those Ishizu cards when they come out. There's also Kelbeck with the hand trap. I would also try to avoid playing into him too much because he bounces like a monster when it's summoned, which can be a huge problem if your deck plays directly into that. And there's Agito as well, but they're just milling at that point. So obviously you just have to be fearful of the mills. If you can, play a deck that can play Shifter. That's the biggest advice I can give you, because it's probably the biggest leg up card you can get going. It stops all of these things pretty well. Obviously tier destroyed, especially when it's with the Ishizu, even harder. Sprites, Sprint is dead. Elf is dead, right? Sending Angler, dead. All those cards are dead. They can pretty much maybe get to 1 red or 1 carrot, and that's mostly it. Runic Fountain. The Runic engine is just dead. They're getting no draws because for the first 2 turns, none of their quick play spells are actually ending up in grave. Very solid versus them. It's slowing them down. Bystial's insane versus them because no lights or darks are hitting the grave except for that one shifter. So just be wary of that. They can summon one Bystial, but they will be locked out of any others. So Magnamut, very mediocre in that scenario. And Cashier doesn't really care, but it's just the one tech card, so it's not that big of a deal. We'll talk about them more when Photon Hypernova actually comes out. So there you go. There's just my advice on looking for decks for like a rogue deck in the current format. If you want me to dig a little bit deeper on this topic, let me know. I'd definitely be down to like actually go through and try to find a couple of like rogue decks that I think have particular niche spots in the metagame right now that actually could really perform at a solid level. Even if they're not as strong as these decks, they would just have good matchups, right? Because if they play a big Bystial package, but your deck does not care about it at all, they could just be playing 5 to 10 dead cards in their deck for you. So even though their engine is stronger than yours, they're just drawing 1 to 2 dead cards game 1, and you've just already got a huge leg up. So kind of depends, but there is some really cool value there. I'd love to get that out to you. So let me know your thoughts on that down below. Let me know your thoughts on this format as a whole and any other factors that you think would matter for a rogue deck and making that decision going forward. But yeah, I'm out of here for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. As always, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more stuff from me, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.